Our next speaker is Elliot Hart from Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission.
All right, thanks. So as you've heard, past few decades, we've really come to understand how significant these hard bottom habitats, and particularly the sponge communities they support, are to the broader coral reef ecosystem here in South Florida. And in the Florida Keys and Florida Bay in particular, well, we've seen what happens when those habitats become degraded. But we've also seen and learned more about their restoration. Now, the area I'm referring to, not familiar with the area, is highlighted in the red box there. It's the Middle Keys, southwest periphery of Florida Bay, about a 3-hour drive south of here. Now, as Mark mentioned, since the early 90s, we've had episodic Cyanobacteria blooms, and in the worst instances, they've had really dramatic effect on these sponge communities. In some cases, wiping out more than 90% of the sponges there. And what you end up with in the worst cases, even our most hardy or some of the most resilient species, like the loggerhead you see here, end up being nasty, dead piles of sponge. You end up with kind of a desert where once there was a thriving sponge community. But story isn't all doom and gloom. We've seen past few years, we have the potential to restore some of these communities, some of the physical structure, and perhaps some of the ecological function associated with them. Now, that sponge restoration process, there's beauty in its simplicity. We go to a healthy sponge, cut the better part of it off, leaving about quarter or fifth of it on the bottom with the intention of allowing it to heal and regrow that lost biomass. We take that cut portion up topside, cut it up like you would a birthday cake, strap them in blocks, and put them down on the bottom where you found them. They sit for a few months, they attach, heal, and eventually you can outplant them to degraded areas. So thankfully, folks at Nature Conservancy, Bonefish Tarpon Trust, Florida Keys Environmental Fund, EPA, have taken notice of this method and seen the potential for its use on a larger scale. And they're now supporting our efforts to scale up this restoration throughout Florida Bay. But of course, scaling it up is going to require a lot more sponges. And taking some inspiration from the success we've seen in coral nurseries throughout the region, we thought, well, perhaps in situ sponge nurseries could be a tool we use. If so, they'd be a readily available supply of sponges for when these blooms happen, we can restore these degraded areas. And we've done just that. In the past year and a half, we've established 4 nurseries. We now have thousands of sponges in them. But now that we're working at a much larger scale, well, there are some basic questions we need to ask. Namely, well, we're dependent on these donor sponges. What if, at least in the beginning stages, what effect are we having on them? Also, these sponges that we, cut, let sit for a few months, and then transfer, could we expedite that process? Could we move them immediately into our nursery system? And these methods that Mark described, they've been tested, they're tried and true. We're just experimenting with some different techniques for propagating these sponges, perhaps refining and maximizing the growth and survival we get out of these. Now, our first question starts with the initial phase in the propagation process, and that is, what effect might we be having, if any, on these donor sponge communities? So in April 2016, we went to several loggerhead and vase sponges. Those are 2 sponges that we commonly are using in our restoration and experiments. We tagged them, we measured them, we cut them, and a year later we came back, and sure enough, we found 85% of those loggerheads, 80% of the vases had survived. And coming to these sites throughout the year, we found that it was on the order of a few weeks to a few months that they actually skinned over and were healing and surviving. However, as you might have seen or noticed in the photo, they are really slow to recover. Right here, there's the volume of the loggerheads before we cut them. right after we cut them, and a year later, they haven't grown at all. Likewise with the vases, this is before we cut them, right after, and a year later, negligible growth. Not so with the sponge cuttings we make from them necessarily, but these are the donor sponges that we cut from. So we're clearly having some impact on those sponges we're cutting from. Now, we've been building up these nurseries with the vision of propagating from within. Let sponges grow up within the nursery, you can further fragment them and thus reduce your impact to those donor communities. But in order to reduce transport stress into the nurseries, we've been collecting from the areas immediately surrounding the nurseries that we have. But it'd be great if we could collect from donor sponges in a broader area, essentially one, to reduce our impact to any one sponge community, but also likely increase genetic diversity within the nurseries. So that brought us to our second question. Rather than having to cut, let them sit for 3 months, might we be able to expedite this process? Can we cut them and move them immediately into our nursery system? We'd be able to move them from further reach throughout the region, potentially increase genetic diversity and lessen our impact to any one particular area. So this past spring, we went to 3 of our nurseries and taken 3 of our most conspicuous, most common sponges. That's loggerhead, base, brown branching, that you've heard plenty about already. We took some of them, we cut them up, and half of them we put right back down in the nursery, in that nursery right there. The other half we split up, and we immediately moved them to the other nursery areas, saying, well, might that immediate transfer have any effect on survival? And we did the same thing with the other 2 nurseries, giving us reciprocal transplant experiment. And what we found, despite little mortality there on some loggerheads that weren't moved, found no difference in survival, which is fantastic. That means we can collect sponges from a broader area, bring them right into our nursery system, and expedite the process. Now, once they're in the nursery, or once we're getting them into the nursery system, can we toy around with some of our techniques for mounting them and growing them out? They're typically cut, mounted to a block, and set right on the bottom there. But at 2 of our nurseries, we asked, well, what if we get them off the bottom there? Just put them on a cinder block, maybe get them up elevated out of that silty layer. And we compared survival between the sponges on the bottom, sponges elevated a little higher after 1 year, came back, despite some of the loggerheads, just a few of the loggerheads dying, no difference between the high and low mounted sponges. Next thing we tested was what we typically use are these commercially available concrete pavers. But we thought, well, what if using this more naturally available, just naturally occurring limestone would work? Could that affect our success in growing them at all? So in one of our nurseries, mounted half of them on blocks, half of them on naturally occurring limestone, came back a year later, but again, found no difference. So we're at the point now where we're refining these methods. We're finding we can make it a little more efficient. We're seeing what effect we might have on the donor communities and adjusting our methods to that. And in the process, we've been building up our nurseries. In fact, we have roughly 6,500 sponges of 8 species. We may be adding more. And that makes up about 90% of what we've actually put down. So actually quite a high survival rate. And now we're at the point where we're starting to plan how we're actually going to put all of these sponges into a large-scale restoration project. Our plan is to get to 15,000 sponges, so we're not quite halfway there yet. And in the next couple of years, depending on the growth of the sponges, plan an outplanting into Florida Bay. Now, one of the great opportunities that this project and this process provides us with is the ability to incorporate members of the community. And folks like Arnie and Reet Steinmetz, Bruce Ferrero there, these are folks that have been in the Keys 40, 50 years. They've seen the degradation of Florida Bay in the Keys. They know it's occurred, and they're very invested in this effort. They're very excited to help, and this has been a great opportunity to include volunteers from the community. And as we get ready to put these sponges to use in an actual restoration project, we'll be including volunteers even more so. So in the next couple of years, we hope to have an update for actually an actual restoration project in the next coming years. Thank you.